Welcome back. We continue in our study of the theology or theologians of the Middle Ages. With this lecture, we'll be essentially concluding with the theologians. We'll have another lecture on the mystics in the Middle Ages. But for now, we're going to deal with some theologians that more than likely you won't hear about anywhere else but in a course like this. But they are important, and so we will continue on with our study here of medieval theology. So let's proceed. The first theologian to look at here goes by the name of John Duns Scotus, or sometimes just Scotus. The name Scotus identifies him, I think, obviously as a Scot. His family's name was Duns, and so he also comes from, it's also the name of the village from which he was born, just a few miles north of the English border in Scotland. So the identifier is commonly used as his last name, Scotus. He's often just referred to by that name, although again that's more of his nationality than his name. The precise date of his birth is not known, but we do know that he was ordained to the priesthood in the order of the Friars Minor, a Franciscan order, at St. Andrew's Priory in Northampton, England, on March 17th of 1291. The minimum age for ordination was 25, so we can conclude that he was born sometime before March 17th, 1266. Scotus studied philosophy and theology at Oxford sometime in the 1280s. In the academic year 1298 to 99, he wrote a commentary on two books of the Sentences. We've heard the Sentences of Peter Lombard before. Then he left Oxford for Paris, which was probably the main university of that day. By that point, the most important university in Europe. And he began lecturing on the Sentences again. In June of 1303, he was expelled from France, probably for taking the side of the Pope at that time in a dispute with King Philip IV of France. And that had to do with the Pope. We'll mention a little bit more about that later. He returned to France in the fall of 1303, so that was a short exile. Became Doctor of Theology in 1305 and moved to Cologne, probably one of the second or third greatest universities at the time, in 1307, and he died there about a year later. Scotus was more a philosophical theologian and wrote a number of works of a philosophical nature, including commentaries on Porphyries. He's the Platonist, Neoplatonist that we've heard about before. That work was Isagoge's, Porphyry's Isagoge, and he also wrote commentaries on Aristotle's Categories and other works by Aristotle, and also an expositio on Aristotle's book on metaphysics. So you can see he was something more of a philosopher, but he did write books on works on theology. As already noted, he wrote some commentaries, and he wrote further commentaries than his earlier ones on the books of Sentences by Peter Lombard. We note John Duns Scotus mostly because he was an advocate of natural theology and natural law. His work on natural theology and formulations for the proof of God's existence is the thing for which we acknowledge him in a course like this more than his philosophical writings. Natural theology is, roughly speaking, the efforts to establish the existence and nature of God by arguments that in no way depend upon revelation. The question is it even possible for human beings to come to know God apart from revelation? Scotus certainly thinks so. Like any good Aristotelian, he thinks that all of our knowledge begins in some way with our experience of the sensible things. So this is the epistemological theory known as empiricism. And he's confident that even from such humble beginnings, we can grasp God. Not only does Scotus attempt to prove that God exists as the first necessary being, who is the cause of all other beings, but he also puts forth evidence that this necessary being, as he argues, must be perfect in knowledge, perfect in will, infinitely good, infinite in power, etc. Scotus actually held that the very first tablet of the Decalogue, the first 5 of the 10 Commandments, could be derived from natural law. I mean, we wouldn't need God to tell us these things, not to make graven images or such, take his name in vain, but that if we would use our reason, we could figure that out on our own without God telling us. The works of John Duns Scotus are, as we've already said, pretty philosophical and esoteric at times, and that's why he has been called the subtle doctor. There's a number of other doctors or teachers, official, that's an official title, semi-official in the Catholic Church. That same nature makes his work difficult to manage for the average reader who's untrained in philosophy. That's why we're not spending a great deal of time with him, just to acknowledge he's one of this later medieval theologians. In fact, scholarly articles about his writing are often as difficult to comprehend as his writing itself. Nevertheless, while the writings of John Duns Scotus may be interesting and helpful to the professional philosopher, there are many other philosophers, apologists, and theologians who are much more readable and accessible to the average Christian today. And so you just need to know there was this individual, and he was concerned with natural theology, and that's about the extent of what we need to know for our particular course. Something of his counterpart, we would say, and one of the last of the medieval theologians was William of Ockham. He was also English, born in Ockham, Surrey in England, sometime between 1280 and 1285. His ambition was to become a monk in the order of the Friars Minor, they're Franciscans again. And in 1306, he received lesser orders and began a rigorous course of study again at Oxford, much as we saw with Scotus. Our knowledge of William of Ockham is pretty limited. Again, we know where he was born, we know where he comes from, mostly, again, because of his name. And he joined the Franciscan order, we have already said that, and studied both in London and in Oxford. Ockham's first major work was a commentary on the sentences by Lombard. You can see that that was the same thing with Scotus by this time. That's where theology was going. Just let's take Peter Lombard's sentences and write commentaries on them, so there's not a lot of original theology being done at this time. However, a problem came up. The chancellor at the University at Oxford, John Luttrell, remanded or sent selections from the commentary, his commentary on the sentences, to the Pope in Avignon. There, Ockham's ideas were censured, and he was summoned to Avignon, to the Pope's presence, to explain his views. After Occam was summoned to Avignon in France, where the papal court held residence, he remained there for 4 years. So, although he was there to explain his views that looked less than orthodox to some of his superiors, he must have been able to convince the authorities there that his work was okay, because they actually kept him on staff there, so to speak, for a while. It's just a side note here to explain something that just came up in this lecture. The Avignon papacy was a time when the Roman Catholic Pope resided in Avignon, France, instead of in Rome. From approximately 1309 to 1377, they moved. The French Catholic Church, the French side of the Catholic Church, was more powerful than the Italian side, or the rest of the Catholic Church. So the cardinals and the authorities managed to move the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church to Avignon. The Avignon papacy is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the church, because if you look at the dates there, it lasted about 70 years, which was the length of the Babylonian captivity of the Jews in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, as recorded in the Bible and noted in Jeremiah 29, verse 10. This arrangement started, again, with the conflict of Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII, and we saw that that impacted the issues with our previous scholar, John Duns Scotus. After Boniface VIII and his successor, Benedict XI, who served only 2 years, died, the cardinals, not a few who were French, most of whom were French, frankly, elected Clement IV from France as the next pope, and Clement decided to remain in France and establish a new papal residence in Avignon. So that's how that happened in 1309. And for the next 6 popes who succeeded him, all of them happened to be French, by the way, they kept the papal enclave in Avignon. And in essence, this meant that there was basically not only an alliance of faith, but a political alliance between the kings of France and the popes of the Roman Catholic Church. So in essence, the kings of France ran not only France, but also the church, much to the consternation of just about every other king in Europe, Catholic king in Europe at the time. So this situation got a great deal more complicated, but that's not really a matter of concern for theology. I just wanted you to know what we were talking about when we talked about the Avignon papacy, or the Pope being in Avignon, France. Well, back to William of Ockham. The main theological controversy of his life was the non-Thomistic views that he held. Now, Thomism is the system of philosophy and theology developed by Thomas Aquinas, and we've dealt with him a little bit more earlier. Aquinas attempted to harmonize the philosophy of Aristotle with Christian theology. We've seen that already. And that system became the most influential system in theological history going forward, and it was called Thomism. And there's some question whether Thomas himself would have held to all of the points of doctrine or ideas in Thomism after him. But nevertheless, when Occam decided that he was going to take issue or disagree with Thomas Aquinas or the strictures of Thomism, well, that got him into some trouble. While he was in Avignon, he wrote philosophical works. That's when he took issues of special importance were Summa Logicae and De Sacramento Altaris. As we noted, Aquinas taught that natural reason could be used to learn true things about God, and we just saw that with John Duns Scotus as well. In the years since Aquinas wrote his 2 Summas that we talked about earlier, his views virtually became the official views of the Roman Catholic Church. So for Occam to question those views or disagree with those views, as I've said, would be a problem for Occam, to say the least. Exactly what was the problem? Well, Occam insisted that faith and reason could never be used to reconcile, could never be reconciled, and that faith, so that reason could construct universals with regard to nature alone. In other words, this is exactly the opposite of both Aquinas and John Duns Scotus, who we just talked about earlier. For Occam, nothing about God, faith, or doctrine could be known in this way. The knowledge of God came by way of revelation only, and only by intimate experience. Now, we've seen this, I won't go through everything we've talked about, but we've seen this toggle back and forth. Some of the medieval theologians thought that there's a great deal you could know and say truthfully about God without using the Bible, without recourse to revelation. And others said no. In fact, even when you do read what's in the Bible, we only know things about God by analogy or in a secondary way. See, really, both of those strains can come through Aquinas in one way or another. But nevertheless, back to Occam, he basically said it's got to be by reason alone. So Pope John the 22nd found it difficult to accept the wholesale attack on Thomism that apparently he felt that Occam represented. Theologically, Occam was a fideist. Now, explain that over in the box there. Fideism is the idea that religious faith and reason are incompatible with each other, and is the view that religious faith is separate from reason and cannot be reconciled with it. You can see the very definition of the term is exactly what we've been saying, is the view of William of Ockham. According to fideism, faith involves a degree of absolute certainty and personal commitment that goes beyond what can be rationally justified. Fideism, you can see, can just be equated with faith in Scripture. Now, we're not necessarily fideists, or at least I'm not, but because I do believe we use reason. But I understand exactly what Occam was getting at here. The idea that we should use philosophy or science in order to understand what the Bible says is okay, as long as you don't let philosophy or science tell you things or deny things, tell you things that are beyond the Bible or deny things that are in the Bible. That's just a little bit of my own understanding of this. But back to Occam. He insisted that theology is not a science and rejected that all the alleged proofs for the existence of God. Think of those 5 ways. Didn't do a video on the 5 ways, but had you read those PowerPoints in the 5 ways of Thomas. Occam believed that human reason can prove neither the immortality of the soul nor the existence of God, nor, for that matter, his unity or infinity or other truths that we read in the Bible that we call his attributes. Those truths are known to us by revelation alone. His main philosophical controversy was the issue of nominalism. And again, this is the course in theology, not philosophy, so I'll just mention this. Occam was a pioneer of nominalism, and he argued strongly that only individuals exist rather than supra-individual universals, essences, or forms, and that universals are the products of abstraction from individuals by the human mind and have no extra mental existence. What that means is think of mankind. Is mankind a thing in and of itself, or is mankind just what we call, by naming it, the collection of all human beings? So we call all of the individual instances of human beings, we call that mankind. But apart from the individual instances, all the millions of people who are here on this planet, is there something called mankind? Or to put it this way, would mankind exist if there weren't all these people? And Occam is saying, no, that's just a name we give to an idea, that we're not talking about something that actually exists. It's a handy name, mankind, but apart from the individuals, there's no real thing called mankind. Now that's the controversy. Again, this is a side note on the subject of the universals. This is kind of heavy, so just bear with me. This is not something you necessarily need to labor over in order to grasp. But the controversy over the universals is this. In Plato's theory, there's the forms, that is, the forms, the ideas. They're really out there. This is called realism. The forms were the universals before things. The universalia ante res in Latin. That is, the universals exist in their own right prior to and independent of their instantiation or their individual instances in the various sensible particulars. I've already used the example of mankind and individual people. So the form of a chair really existed before there was any particular chair. So this is somewhat difficult for us to sort of grasp, but would chairness exist if there were no chairs? And Plato says, well, sure, it would be there. For Aristotle, and this is the view that Occam is picking up on, in his view, he denied that the forms were real. He denied there were universals existing in their own right prior to and independent of their instantiation of sensible particulars. But he did hold a more moderate form of realism, universalia in rebus, that universal in things. So that what that means is, while there are universals, they can have no freestanding, independent existence. That is, of course, there's something called mankind, but that's only because there's all these individuals, these individual people. Universals exist, but only in the particulars that instantiate them, or the particular instances of them. So again, there is a mankind, but not apart from particular individual persons. So there's something there. There's something we can sort of generally understand is there, but it's not as real as the individual persons that necessarily have to be there in order for that universal to be there. So against Plato and Aristotle is nominalism, which holds that there are no universals but only particulars. Nominalists say that we seem to see universals, but we're just, again, naming something, nominalism, a collection of similar features or qualities we notice in particular individual men and persons. It's not really there. So nominalists, notably William of Ockham, insisted that everything in the non-linguistic world is just a particular. Nominalists argued that universals are merely words, again, names, that's why the word nominalism, which have a general application, an application which is sufficiently explained by reference to the similarities among the various particulars to which the words are applied. So what I'm about to say is not on the slide, but there's a strong nominalism, and then there's sort of a modified nominalism, and not to get too deep here, but sometimes Ockham seemed to be a strong nominalist, and sometimes he's to be a moderate nominalist. And there's where his controversy really lies. All right, back to Ockham. And this is the part that I want to emphasize. For this class, we don't need to know exactly and fully understand the philosophy here. So if all of that was a little bit heavy, and you don't need to go back over it and try to get it. It's not our class. If this was a class in philosophy, yes, but here, no. So we just need to know that Ockham disagreed with Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle, for that matter. And that meant that his views put him at odds with the theology of the Catholic Church. But more seriously, we need to understand this nominalism seems to be problematic when we're thinking about the Trinity. If we think the Trinity is only a name, if there's no divine being, if there's no oneness to God, think of the Nicene Creed. If the one God is just a name, and all godness is only seen in the three persons, the divine being is something separate from the three persons, that would be a problem. Or if it doesn't exist without the three persons, that would be a problem. So in short, if the divine nature is merely a name or concept and has no ontological or actual reality, then, and this is the charge that was brought against William of Ockham, they thought that he was espousing or teaching something like tritheism, or three gods and three persons. And that obviously can be a problem. In addition to the controversy over the universals, Ockham was involved in another controversy, and this is, basically within the doctrine of the Catholic Church, the controversy over apostolic poverty. Michael Sesesna, the head of the Franciscan order, attempted to return his friars to the ideals of strict poverty advocated by Francis of Assisi. But this was seen as an attack on the indulgence and luxury of the Catholic hierarchy, that they had become very rich and lived a very sort of comfortable, even luxurious life. And the Franciscans saw that as a problem. Ockham himself believed that a lifestyle of poverty was closer to that of the apostles and was of, quote, the true gospel origin, which stood in harsh contrast to the extravagance, and corruption of the late medieval church. Pope John XXII declared that belief in apostolic poverty was something heretical. So Michael Sesesna, the head of the Franciscans, and his followers, including Ockham, were excommunicated from the church at that time. In 1328, they fled to the protection of the German Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria, and thereafter Ockham questioned both papal and conciliar, that is the authority of councils, and seems to have concluded that individual conscience was the final test of faith. So you can see that Ockham had some ideas that we would agree with. Actually, Ockham had some influence on Luther. We should mention that here because that won't come up later when we talk about Luther, but it did. So in some ways, there are ideas that he had that we would say were good and others that we would question. On this controversy of apostolic poverty, on May the 26th, Ockham and his numbers, as we've already said, they fled to the court of Ludwig of Bavaria, or Louis of Bavaria, and Ockham was to stay in southern Germany, mainly Munich, under the protection of the emperor until the end of his death. And sadly, there's some speculation that he was a victim of the Black Death that rolled through in the 14th century at this time. I should mention this, even though this is philosophy and not theology, but I should mention the fact that the teaching for which Occam is best known today is something called Occam's razor. In popular handbooks of philosophy, William of Occam is best known for Occam's razor, that is, the notion that beings are not to be multiplied beyond necessity, or explanations are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. You can see the Latin phrase there. This exact turn of phrase cannot be found in Occam's writings, but if anybody knows anything about Occam, they're going to know about Occam's razor, so I guess I'm trying to help you make sure you at least know what that means. Again, a sort of technical way of saying this is no plurality should be assumed unless it can be proved by reason, by experience, or by some infallible authority. But down at the bottom of that slide, the basic idea is this. The simplest explanation is the best. If you have like an issue or a problem or a theory or a question, and you have several answers to that, and one answer is pretty simple, but the other of them are fairly complex, Occam would say the simplest answer is the best. Or even another way to put this is don't make things more complicated than they have to be. And that's usually the more popular way that people remember Occam's razor. Whether he would have put it that way or not, again, I just wanted you to know where that expression came from and sort of what it means. So what's the influence? William of Occam's influence stimulated the growth of mysticism and fed the spiritual movement, or spiritual environment, I should say, in which the Reformation occurred. So as I said, some of his ideas were picked up on when Luther went to study theology. He studied William of Occam as much as anybody else. So some of his ideas certainly would have influenced him. But his works also influenced the growth of medieval mysticism as well. And I wanted to put that in there because that makes a great transition to our next part of our study, when we're going to look at medieval mysticism in one short lecture. As all of these lectures, much more could be said, but at least we'll give you an exposure to some of those ideas. So we'll stop for now and see you then.